in that this is really asking for input from all of you on this call and the webinar to assist in providing information as to what has been going well and what has not been going so well. We want to get your feedback on that, and we'll do that through a series of polls where we will ask you to respond that it did go well or that it did not go well, and then we'll open up the phone lines for some comment, or you can place your comments and if you have questions in the chat pod as well. Because of it being set up that way, we do ask that each of you mute your phones when you're not anticipating speaking to a particular item so that we don't get a lot of background noise. We will try this just with an open concept, and hopefully we don't step all over each other and everyone wanting to speak at the same time. But if you have responded to a question, maybe you can wait a second or two and let someone else try to respond the next time around, and then you can jump in if you really feel you still have additional information you would like to provide. But again, the primary focus of today's webinar is to identify what things went well so that we can maintain those going forward, but also really identify those things that we could improve on. We have Skip Hedger and Christy Jones with Kerbeck and Breckel here today. Skip will start out with an overview, then we will get to each of the polls. There's 19 different items that we want to address today. I will read each of those. Skip will provide a little bit of overview of each of those, and then we will open them up to you. So once we put up the poll, you can start answering, responding to the positive or the negative aspect of the poll, and then we will go from there. Hopefully you've all you obviously called into the right number. We do have a different number, and I want to remind everyone, we'll do it again at the end of this. We have a webinar scheduled for next Wednesday on career pathways for youth. However, it is going to be in the afternoon because of some conflicts with the morning session that we've been having on a regular basis. So please, if you want to join that one, it's going to be from 1:30 to 3 next Wednesday rather than the 10 to 11:30 session we normally have. And please let your staff know that, and Christy Jones will be sending out a reminder for that later today or tomorrow. That session will have Dr. Brian Durham from the Community College Board as the main speaker, and so I think it'll be a good one for getting some information on career pathways, especially for our youth customers. So with that, we'll get started. I'll turn it over to Skip, and like I said, we'll let you know when you can respond either verbally or, again, use the chat pod as you wish.
Good morning, everybody. This is Skip Hedger from KEB. I think everyone knows that we're in the early stages of revising the governor's guidelines, which were originally developed and distributed about a year ago. A major revision is necessary for two primary reasons. The first is to incorporate the new requirements of the WIOA final rule, which was published long after the original guidelines were developed. And the second one is to do what Mark said, and that is to improve the guidelines where possible to make it easier to do the tremendous work that WIOA requires be done locally to structure how services are going to be delivered. So I'll get into very briefly the timeline for the revision in just a minute, but to begin with, just to review the purpose of the webinar. Mark, you want to advance the slide? It is, as Mark said, to obtain input from all of you regarding your experience under the governor's guidelines in PY16, which, as everybody remembers, was a different year because there was a lot of uncertainty about which requirements would apply and which would not. The second purpose is to use this input to inform the upcoming second major revision of the governor's guidelines. The major steps in the timeline in the revision process, just so you know, there was an online survey of LWIB chairs and lead negotiators that happened a couple of weeks ago. We got some good comments and feedback from that survey. Unfortunately, the response rate was very low. But we're hoping that we'll expand on these perspectives in this webinar, which is, again, to obtain information and perspectives from others who were involved in the MOU process for PY16. There's a consultation with the IWIB on key concepts that will be included in the revision to the governor's guidelines. The WIOA requires that the governor consult with the IWIB, and there is a plan in place for doing that. Once the concepts and revisions to the governor's guidelines are available in draft form, these will be presented to the WIOA interagency work group for review. We're hoping and expecting that to happen in early November. Then there will be a final consultation with the IWIB following review by the interagency work group. And then the distribution of the second major revision to the governor's guidelines is anticipated to happen in early December, with webinars to respond to questions and to provide clarification scheduled for mid-December, which is very similar to what happened last year, many of you may remember. So getting on then to the input part of this webinar, which as Mark said is the primary purpose, there are 18 specific concepts that we want to get your input on as to what worked well and what didn't work well, and then there's also an open question at the end for any other suggestions that you might have. But these 18 areas cover basic concepts that are included in the current version, the version that was used in PY16 of the governor's guidelines. The process for the webinar today is pretty straightforward, as Mark mentioned. We're going to go through these concepts one by one, and Mark will provide instructions as to what you need to do, and basically we're asking you for input as to whether that concept worked well or didn't work well, and then provide an opportunity for anybody who wishes to elaborate on their response. So with that, Mark, you want to begin the process?
Okay, I'm going to move the PowerPoint out. The rest of the PowerPoint really is each of the questions, so we'll start with the first poll here. And as you'll see, you'll be able to see everyone else's responses. So our first comment or response should be on the designation by the board chair of a single individual to lead the MOU negotiations. Again, please respond whether that worked well for your area or region, or if it did not. Once we give you a few seconds here to provide us your response, we'll focus on both the positive and negative, but especially if there's a high significant shift to one side or the other, we'll want to make sure that everyone else can learn from those positives or negatives going forward. So again, Skip, if you want to add to that particular one.
Not really. I think this one is pretty straightforward. The concept that was in the governor's guidelines was to require the board chair to identify someone as the lead negotiator.
I think with this one, we probably should start with those that didn't work so well, and if somebody wants to provide us maybe some insight as to what do you think didn't work so well, and maybe someone from the other side that thought it did work well can respond to that with their positive thoughts on that. So anyone that identified this as it didn't work well, if you would like to speak forward or put your comment in the chat pod, please do. Again, don't be shy with the comments. We really need to learn from you so that we can improve this process for the next round and improve these guidelines. So, hopefully if you are responding, you have a comment to make to that, and don't be shy about doing that. We need to learn from you. If someone else has a positive comment they want to share that they think others can learn from, you can share those as well.
Yeah, obviously we're going to have to look at them.
Okay, we've got I'll go ahead and also answer questions when those come up. So local area 2 has asked what authority was there over state agencies. Skip, can you reply, or maybe some of our state agency partners?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what the question is really, what authority was over state agencies. If what you're getting at is how did the state agencies, how were they involved in all this, the answer to that is through the WIOA interagency work group, which is comprised of all the state agency partners who meet monthly at least and come together at other times to review issues related to implementation of WIOA. So So I guess the answer is that it's the WIOA interagency work group that is most involved in all this. Obviously, the authority over state agencies is the governor, and the governor's involvement in this has been, as you would expect, not detailed. There's been no detailed involvement from the governor's office, but the governor's office has been and is kept aware and made aware of issues as they arise.
We do have a couple people typing. Let's just give 1 second for those. We can also come back to some of these if in the chat pod. So a follow-up to that, Skip, is they're indicating the board representative cannot make decisions because the state agencies had the authority and the board representative felt they didn't have the ability to moderate fully.
Yeah, and coming up in the next 2 or 3 concepts that we're asking your input on is input on that specific question, because the guidelines made it very clear, in a concept in the guidelines that was very clear, was that each person designated by a state agency needed to have the authority to make commitments, both programmatic and financial, for that partner. So we're going to be asking about that more specifically in just a minute.
Okay, I see where a good comment in saying that maybe the individual, being a sole person, didn't feel comfortable making some of the decisions because they didn't have authority over or on behalf of institutions who they had little ability to negotiate for, and needed more input from all adult ed partners and institutions in each area.
Again, there's a specific question on that too coming up.
Okay, great. And then we have a positive. I think it's good to have one person responsible for making sure everything gets done. I think we would agree with that. We have to have somebody take charge.
Yeah.
And then they build a team from there if necessary to help them and support them in their decision making. Okay, we'll move ahead to number 2 here. And this is related to the designation by the board chair of a private sector board member or other impartial individual to lead the cost negotiations.
And the one comment I would make about this is that the emphasis is really on the impartial individual. There was no requirement that this impartial individual be a private sector board member, although that is there in the governor's guidelines as an option. But the core of the concept is someone who is impartial to negotiate costs, because as everybody understands, that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where it gets very sensitive, is in the cost negotiations.
Okay, most of us, the responses we've seen are leaning towards that it did not work so well. Was that because it was hard to find the impartial person, or could someone elaborate with their selection on that question? Okay, so someone's indicated that not all partners have budgets to negotiate due to lack of a state budget, which impedes the process.
Well, I think everybody's hoping that was a characteristic that was unique to PY16, but we'll see. But it was a factor for sure in PY16.
Okay, and another comment is referring to the fact that assigning of FTEs to various agencies, some of those aren't consistent in assigning FTEs. And maybe we should have within our guidelines the FTEs for each agency.
Right, and again, that specific question is coming up, and that is an area in the governor's guidelines where there will be revisions, in part because of the new requirements in the final rule.
Okay, someone else indicated part of the difficulty was that they were required to contract out to find a person well-versed in the law to negotiate for them. And then another indicating our board decided to hire a consultant So we've had a couple local areas that hired consultants to do this, to be the impartial person, but their knowledge of WIOA was a little bit limited, maybe.
And the consultant hire is a good example of an impartial individual.
Yeah, it does. It seems like several of the local areas did utilize consultants, and their knowledge of the process and the law seemed to lack, maybe caused some of the difficulties in this process. And then another comment would be that one of the local areas wish they could have their board chair or private members be part of the process, but they don't have the time or the expertise. Therefore, they went, for a bid process to a consultant as well. Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a few responses there. That's what we really want to hear is for you to provide us that input. So that's a good thing that seems to be consistent with everybody in their difficulties on that particular item. Again, don't feel threatened to speak over the phone, and might be a little bit quicker to respond if you utilize the phone as opposed to trying to type everything into the chat pod. We'll move on to number 3, which is designation of individuals by required partners who have the authority to make program and financial commitments on behalf of the required partner.
And this came up in comments just a few minutes ago, but this is an important concept where there is explicit language in the governor's guidelines that requires this, and to the extent that didn't happen, we need to work harder at a state level to make sure that happens going forward. And it's looking like it didn't work very well so far. Overwhelming.
Okay, pretty strong on this one, and one of them, which has kind of been a theme under WIA that people were concerned coming into WIOA, is that getting all the partners to pick up their fair share. It seems like one local area is indicating that Title 1B took on all of those costs, so that is a definite concern going forward in cost sharing and many other things, to ensure that everyone does participate to the level that they are required to. We've got a couple more typing in. Maybe someone that did answer on the positive can share what you thought, why you thought it went well in your area. Maybe you didn't have that issue as far as getting commitments from all the agency partners. Maybe, we know every local area is different, and some work in conjunction with others much better. So if someone wants to respond to the positive side of that, please do. Okay, this is some good insight to move forward on that one. With the negatives, it definitely looks like we'll have to look into those and consider them as we move forward, and rely on that interagency team for further discussions on how to make that work more smoothly. All right, we'll move on to number 4, which is designation of a single individual to negotiate on behalf of multiple providers of adult education.
In both this question and the next question, which is similar to it except Perkins, are unique to those partners. In this particular one, the adult ed partner, because of the multiple numbers of providers that may exist in some LWIAs, rather than have multiple providers at the table, ICCB attempted to work with these providers to identify a single provider that could participate in negotiations on behalf of the others.
We'll await some of the responses being typed in here for a moment. It does look like this one at least leans more heavily to the positive side. So
I think ICCB worked pretty hard to try and make that happen and put a lot of time into it. And I know, like most things, it wasn't perfect, but they did work very hard at it.
Okay, and as Skip said, we'll go ahead and move on to 5, which is very similar, but involves career and technical education entities, or Perkins. So please provide us how that worked.
And the difference here, of course, is that for the most part, these are community colleges. In the prior question, these were adult ed providers, which can be, but are not always community colleges. This really is the community college where you have multiple community colleges in the local area, having one of those be the representative for all in the negotiations for an MOU.
And on behalf of the Community College Board, we do have LaVon with us today. She's responding that they're seeing some additional work they need to do and discussions that need to be had to make it work even more smoothly, going back to question number 4 on the adult education side.
It's good to get this feedback, and I'm sure ICCB will be encouraged that while it's not perfect, that for the most part it seems as though their efforts paid off and it did work well, for PY16.
Okay, and we'll go ahead and move over. Here we go. LaVon has indicated also they have their own grant with each college and they have local autonomy and encourage them to work together, but this should improve for next year. We will discuss, they will discuss internally. So again, going back to they will continue their discussions to make this process work more smoothly at the community college level. We'll move on to number 6, which is the value of state-level career services summary as a starting point for service delivery negotiations and development of a local service matrix.
And this question and the next one are really companion questions, and they really have to do with what we commonly refer to as the service matrix, which is included in the governor's guidelines, which is intended as a starting point for local negotiations regarding the services that each required partner is required to provide in a comprehensive one-stop center, as well as the method of service delivery. This area, the service matrix, both career services and other programs and activities, is also an area where the final rule makes significant changes, and so that will obviously affect the content of the revision to the governor's guidelines on this point.
It looked like this one worked well for most people. Pretty strongly in favor of that it did work well. We've got a couple people typing in again. We'll give them a moment to complete their thoughts. Okay, so someone has indicated that as a starting point, they agreed that it was fine, but it ended up being more of a requirement with certain responses expected. So we can learn from that and look towards maybe some minor tweaking of that area going forward. And then, as Skip said, number 7 is very closely related to that, in that the value of the state-level programs and activity summary for service delivery negotiations and development of a local service matrix.
And again, these would be services and activities that a required partner plans to provide at a comprehensive one-stop center that are not career services. That's the distinction.
Skip, during all this process, did you or the interagency team get specific comments or questions that maybe aren't quite being provided to us today that you can?
Well, you know, just that there was no vacuum. There was each local partner of a member of the WIOA interagency work group was in constant communication with their central partner, and so at each interagency work group meeting, there was always input and concerns and problems that were being raised locally that were coming to a state partner that were part of the discussion, and again, trying to resolve those where possible. So, yeah, I think there was a pretty good awareness of what was working and what wasn't working as the process was going on.
Okay, so one commenter said that there are some partners disagreeing with that matrix, so obviously we need to revisit the matrix. I know that was a pretty long discussion amongst everyone and referring to the actual act. And some of that confusion might have come because we didn't have final rules when all of this was getting drawn up and that. And so maybe we had in the preamble to the final rules some clarification that will help going forward. And to remind everyone, the preamble is almost better to read than the final rules at times because it really gives you a basis of understanding of why the departments made the decisions they did, especially when something changed from the proposed rules to the final rules, or if something was added in these final rules that didn't exist in the act itself. So, you know, I know most of us, if not all of us, read that preamble, but that really, to me, is a very good starting point for understanding, getting a better understanding of what's required.
And also, I would only say that I think the state-level partners know that it's an ongoing educational challenge to educate their local partners about key concepts related to WIOA implementation, one of which is what's in the career service matrix, what's in the programs and activities matrix, and what does that mean, and what does it mean for them locally. So it is an ongoing process of education between state and local partners to assure that there's a common understanding about many of these things.
Okay, so again, going forward, we'll have to look at that service matrix and make sure that it does match up with, and everyone agrees with it at the end, because those negotiations are based on the services everyone should be providing. Moving to number 8, the comment or the question in hand is the required use of a standard MOU template and whether that worked well. And I guess, you know, you could almost, if you would respond to was the template a good template? And did the process of using a template work well? Generally, I know from the Title I standpoint, when we draft policy and there's something that needs to be consistent, the local areas look to us a lot and ask for templates, and they help us develop those at times. So, you know, a template is a very nice starting point for a lot of people to ensure they've included everything and then have some flexibility to add to it. So I could see where it would be very valuable here, and it looks like overwhelmingly the tool worked well this time.
Yeah, and it just, again, it's straightforward rather than have templates come in or MOUs come in, each of which was approached however it was decided locally and deal with all that. The idea was instead have a common format that everybody uses, the contents of which would be different, but the format would be the same for everybody.
Great. All right, then. Good to hear all the positives there. Number 9 is the voluntary use of example language included in the supporting document to the MOU template, and I think that kind of plays off of what we just talked about, that if we can provide some consistency and starting points, it makes it much easier, and I think from a monitoring standpoint, not necessarily related to this, but in general, it's nice to see things that are consistent, and you know where to go to find them to make sure they're included, rather than having 22 local or 10 regional plans that look totally different, and you have to, search pretty in-depth to try and find everything.
There's a little bit of a backstory to this one, as some of you may remember. At one point, this was referred to as model language, and there were a number of local areas that didn't like that term because out of fear that it would become required language, which was never the point. So in the end, it morphed into what is called example language. Part of the thing that was observed within the interagency work group is it seemed as though there wasn't a common understanding of what example language meant. In some cases, a local person would say, we're using the language the state requires, so we should be okay, but that's not the case. This is not required language. This is simply example language. So any input or comments you have about how you perceive this language and its value, and whether you saw it as being a starting point or being language that you could adopt and saw as being bulletproof, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I also like the one comment that was made. While it's overwhelmingly positive that these last couple items worked well, they still would like their ability to have flexibility in their area, and so unlocking the template or somehow, and we would want to look at that if we want to have an ability to add on to the template from a local or regional perspective, or have an addendum to it where you can make changes. We'd definitely look into that so that you can tailor that best fits your particular system. Number 10 relates to the preferred use of an umbrella agreement.
And again, there was a preference expressed for this in the governor's guidelines over the partner-specific agreement, which is also an option under WIOA, but the preference owes mainly to a concern for transparency. Having an umbrella agreement is more transparent than having individual agreements with partners.
Okay, another very positive result there that we can take a little bit of looking at going forward, but it looks like it worked well for most people. We'll move on to number 11, which is the required use of a standard budget form.
Again, this is pretty simple and straightforward, having a standard budget form that differentiates between infrastructure costs and other shared local service delivery system costs. And an Excel spreadsheet that was provided for use in all local areas, and I think some form of standard budget form is essential. But in terms of your experience working with the one that was made available for PY16, appreciate any feedback you have.
I could see the same kind of comments being made where they would like a little bit of flexibility, and maybe the way they classify or the pot they put particular expenses in might not fit the way it looks on a a provided template or form. So I could see where we want to have that flexibility as well, and we are getting those kind of comments. So we need to look at that again. What we don't want to happen is it end up looking like 10 different region or 22 different local areas, and it becomes very difficult to review those because they all look so different. So unlocking them is part of the answer, but there would have to be a little bit of probably limitations on how much changes should be made in some of these things so that it doesn't become an entirely different document.
Yeah.
Based on
And some of that, derives probably from a desire to be helpful. And I'm thinking in particular of the section of the format that had to do with FTEs. So it did get fairly complicated when you had to enter FTEs and how those mattered in other aspects of the spreadsheet. But it's really what the balance is between trying to save time and at the same time provide a level of standardization that really is needed.
Other than needing some flexibility by unlocking these, we do have quite a few negative that it didn't work so well in your particular case. If you can elaborate on that a little bit, that would be great. We can work off of that then. Okay, no other responses look like they're coming in. We'll move on to the prescribed 90-day period allowed for local negotiations.
Yes, and under the original governor's guidelines, this period was from January 1st through the end of March. And the reason for that period, there are several reasons for it, not the least of which is that depending on whether there is agreement or not, it triggers other things that have to happen and be completed by July 1st. So that's why the 90-day period is there, is to enable the other things that follow, particularly from when local areas cannot or did not agree to address those specific areas in between April and June. There's also a required reporting in the regulations to the governor of the outcomes from the MOU, and a requirement that a schedule be developed for that reporting, and so this fulfills that requirement.
One of the comments I don't know that we can really provide an answer to. We know it's an issue in Illinois, that it's hard to negotiate some things when you have a budget crisis that Illinois has been in for a period of time, and so it's hard to work to agreements because of that. And I don't know that I think we tried to provide some information on what you could do aside of that, but there's definitely going to be some restrictions that creates when we do have those budget crises. And another person is indicating 90 days may not be enough time based on all of the people that need to be involved in this, all the entities that need to be involved in the discussions. Is there flexibility on that time limit, Skip?
Well, I mean, sure, there could be some, but again, things back up from July 1st. So if you add more time here, you squeeze more time at other places. And one example of that is there is a 45-day remediation period that attempts to help facilitate agreement where there is no agreement. That could be cut to 30 days and allow 15 more days for the negotiation, but you're squeezing at the back, and that's something that has been suggested and will be considered in the revision, is changing that 45 days to 30 days and expanding, giving that 15 extra days to the upfront negotiations.
Okay, so we can at least look into that, because that seems to be an issue that maybe a few local areas indicate it wasn't enough time, so that will be considered. The next item is the prescribed steps in the local MOU negotiations process.
Yeah, and again, the original version of the governor's guidelines had some very prescriptive steps that local areas were encouraged to follow in terms of the number of meetings, and I don't know how closely those steps were followed or not, or whether you see having them identified as being helpful or not, but that's the question for input.
Okay, mostly positive here as well. With no comments, I don't see. We'll move on to the limitations of infrastructure funding under the state funding mechanism to one comprehensive one-stop center per area, with the exception of LWIA 7, which was allowed to have additional comprehensive centers.
And the emphasis for this is clearly under the state funding mechanism, under the local funding mechanism, which essentially means all local partners agree. There could be, local partners could agree to have more than one comprehensive one-stop center. It's just that for funding under the state mechanism, it's limited to one, except for Cook County, Chicago.
It appears very positive on that note. The next item is the submission of a draft budget by February 28th while negotiations were still underway.
Yeah, and the emphasis here obviously is on the draft budget, and remembering back, and maybe a little bit surprisingly, I think almost every LWIA submitted a draft budget by the 28th of February. And I think there was a lot of concern that that wasn't a lot of time to do that. And even though it was a draft budget, not a final budget.
And it appears this is, that may have been the strong point being made. A lot of the didn't work so well are being selected, and it's maybe the time frame.
Yeah.
Rushing through it and not feeling like they provided a real, even though it's a draft budget, you still like to put as close a picture together as you can at that particular time.
Yeah. And one thing that could be considered and has been talked about a little is having that come in with the outcomes report on March 31st rather than in advance of that. So just put those two things together. So that's a possibility.
Any suggestions from anyone there with this overwhelming response level that we have here? And again, the phone lines are open for everyone. You should be able to speak if you'd wish to do that over typing in your response. Okay, it looks like there's some confusion on where they were at in the process in addition to that time frame. And then understanding what the purpose of submitting the draft budget was.
Yeah, and those are obviously all good questions. And part of the reason to have a draft budget earlier on is linked to statewide infrastructure funding caps and getting a sense of how resources might be spread across local areas under the state statutory funding caps for infrastructure costs. All that has to be revisited, however, because as everyone knows, there were major changes in infrastructure funding requirements in the final rule. But I think originally that was one of the reasons for the early submission, was to allow state agencies to begin to decide how they could allocate resources across local areas.
Okay, the next item is the submission, and Skip just alluded to this, submission of a report of outcomes from the MOU negotiations that was due on March 31st. I would imagine any of these with due dates, Skip, probably have the time frame.
Oh, yeah.
That there wasn't enough ever given. So we understand there was a lot going on These weren't the only things that we're doing as we implement WIOA and all of its provisions. Also, the asking of submissions before even the final rules came out. So, in some cases, the understanding of what really needed to be included and wasn't fully understood. So it's definitely understandable when the negative responses come in that they didn't feel they either had the information or the time necessary. Yeah, and that's the main focus, is that time frame. So I think we'll definitely have to look at those. Obviously, things have to be done in a particular time frame, but if we can expand those or shift things around a little bit going forward to meet some of the concerns, we certainly would want to address that if possible. Next would be the prescribed 45-day period for remediation, and Skip has alluded to potential for changing that time frame in order to provide additional time on something else.
In the purpose of that remediation period, obviously two. One is to make sure that that any disagreements, if there's a possibility they can be overcome, to do that within this remediation period, so that partners do agree on the MOU and the sharing of costs. And the second reason is to avoid impasses, and under WIOA, the governor has to report any impasse to the heads of the federal agencies, and no one would consider that to be a good thing. So it's, again, an extra step built into the process to try and help facilitate local agreement, and at the same time to avoid federal reporting of impasses.
And it seemed like everyone felt the 45-day period was enough. Hopefully, if we have to shift things around, a few less days might not be an issue if that's the scenario that has to be pursued.
And I think just that just for information, that state level teams were activated in 5 or 6, maybe 7 cases, and were able to work with local partners to resolve mostly the disagreements that were keeping them from being in agreement.
Okay, the next item is the final polling item at this time, and it's just the general process features intended to lead to good faith, give and take negotiations, respectful of the needs, desires, and constraints of all of those involved in these negotiations. Just kind of how the process went in general, and everyone's working together to make it happen.
And again, these are just basic concepts that I hope everybody found reflected in different places in the governor's guidelines, because they were intended to show up in different ways and in different places.
Okay, we do have a couple people. Let's give just a couple more seconds while they complete their thoughts in the chat pod, and then we'll be able to move to the last item. One is a very good comment in that, everyone's worked together with all of these entities over the years. Speaking together and working out issues shouldn't be new just because it's WIOA, and so everyone should be able to reflect on the past and be able to make these make these things work smooth because of the relationships that have been built up over the years. Okay, so our last one isn't necessarily a poll, it's just kind of overall reflection. We've seen a lot of positives in this process. Looking at the poll, there were definitely a few that had more negative than positive in the sense that we could build on those comments and improve for the next round of negotiations and all all that's related to those governor's guidelines. But does anyone have any other input or suggestions that you would like to provide at this time? We definitely know the time frames seem to be the main concern in many areas, is that there wasn't enough time. Hopefully going through the process a second time around with a little more guidance might help that out, as now we have been through this once and know what we're coming up against as far as what needs to be negotiated. But are there any other suggestions anyone wants to have or provide for consideration going forward? Okay, one comment is that they think these revised guidelines should come as soon as possible because the process needs to start fairly soon. And again, going back to timelines, try not to be any more rushed than necessary to meet certain guidelines. Another area is asking that each state partner provide a little more guidance and direction from their perspective that can help get through this process. And kind of to add to that is even within agencies, ensuring all the proper individuals are getting the information necessary from the state agency down to the local areas. Seems like maybe sometimes they came without information, which probably definitely made the discussions much more difficult to speak on behalf of their agency and program. We do have a couple more typing in, Skip, but do you have any overall thoughts after you see their responses that you can?
No, just appreciation for the comments and the input. Not a lot of surprises, I guess, is my overall reaction. I would also say that that the window's still open if you think of things after this webinar that you want to suggest as improvements or areas of concern. Please do that. As I mentioned when I describe the timeline, we're really trying to be in a good position by the early November. So yet this month, if things occur to you or you have ideas or thoughts about improvements, I would suggest that you send those to us, and the right place to do that would be to Christy Jones. I think everybody probably knows her email address, but if not, it's christyj@kebcpa.com. So she would be the individual to whom you would send any additional comments or suggestions that you have.
Yeah, everyone should, we're all on her list for notifications for webinars. So maybe the one she sent out with this PowerPoint on it, you could just reply to it. Mm-hmm. That way it has this subject matter, and it's easy for her to identify that you're commenting to this webinar mm-hmm. and each of the components of it. And Chelsea has put it in there if you just want to go directly to that. But, we'll leave the chat pod open here for a few more minutes. We've discussed all of these, and we've taken your concerns, your additional questions, especially where it worked positively. We want to build off of that, but look into those negative areas that need to be improved on. We appreciate all your input, and hopefully this went along the lines you thought will be helpful in improving and making suggestions to change for those guidelines. With that, we can end the session over the telephone. We'll leave the room open again for a few more minutes if you have a few more thoughts you want to share in the chat pod. Again, as a reminder, next week we do have a WIOA Wednesday webinar. Please tell your staff and local area partners that it will be from 1:30 to 3 rather than from 10 to 11:30. It will be on the career pathways for youth. Dr. Brian Durham from the Illinois Community College Board will be the main presenter for that, and we will utilize the call-in number you used today rather than the one we've used in past webinars. We've just got some conflicts going on this week and next week with times and telephone availability, conference call numbers. So we will have that in the chat room as normal. So when you log in next week at 1:30, you'll see the new number. So in case you accidentally dial in the old one and don't seem to get the proper individuals, please check the chat room for the appropriate number. With that, appreciate it. Thank you. And